The iPhone 14 series is at once controversial and underwhelming. When its latest phones, Apple chose to ditch the physical SIM card slot but continue to avoid adopting USB-C, and on the non-Pro models they are still the notch. At the same time, the iPhone 14 looks nearly identical to its predecessor, at least on the outside. It has slightly improved cameras, a new high-G accelerometer for crash detection, and the ability to connect to satellites for emergency communications. Apple also decided to revive a larger Plus model this year in lieu of a new iPhone mini and kept the same A15 Bionic chip instead of upgrading to the A16 Bionic powering the iPhone Pro line. The Plus won't be available until October, and we only have the smaller $799 model in for review right now. So far, save for some controversial changes and emergency applications, the iPhone 14 is the very definition of an incremental upgrade. The best way to distinguish between the iPhone 13 and 14 is by looking for the SIM tray on the left. The new phone doesn't have one. Other than that, the only difference this year are the new color options, purple and blue. I like them, but they don't inspire the same sort of lust in me that the green iPhone 12 or pink iPhone 13 did. The lack of change isn't a bad thing, by the way. Apple's handsets may seem predictable, but they still feel expensive and well made. They also have the same IP68 rating for dust and water resistance, as well as the same ceramic shield protecting this display from scratches. It feels like the company has settled on a design for the foreseeable future and won't be deviating from it much. In fact, the iPhone 14 has nearly the same dimensions as the iPhone 13. Despite being a hundredth of the inch thicker, it's 2 grams lighter. For comparison's sake, the iPhone 14 is also heavier than the Galaxy S22, but otherwise the same size. Although not much on the outside has changed, Apple did say at its Far Out event last week that it redesigned the iPhone 14's internals by separating the aluminum housing and the glass of the phone's back so they are no longer on enclosure. This brings two benefits: more efficient heat dissipation and improved repairability. If you crack the iPhone 14's back glass, you will no longer have to get the entire housing replaced. This makes fixing a broken iPhone not only easier but also cheaper, especially when your phone is out of warranty. Of course, destroying my review unit just to test this out doesn't make sense, but it's welcome change regardless. I'm kind of upset that Apple still hasn't upgraded the iPhone 14's screen. It still runs at 2532 into 1170 and a mere 60 Hz. What gives? The last generation was already woefully outdated with its slow refresh rate. When I switch between the iPhone 14 and the 14 Pro, I immediately notice how much choppier scrolling is the regular phone. The iPhone 14's display is brighter than before, but only slightly. It now goes up to 1200 nits when showing HDR content, which makes things easier to see in sunlight. Colors are rich and details are crisp. No surprises here. If you have seen one iPhone display, you have seen them all, at least in recent years. The bulk of improvements on the iPhone 14 have to do with its cameras. Specifically, there's larger 12 megapixel sensor with bigger 1.9 micron pixels than before, as well as updated low light processing that Apple is calling the photonic engine. This should make for better pictures not just in low light but also greater clarity in all conditions. Compared to the previous generation though, this year's cameras aren't a huge step up. Photos I shot with the iPhone 14 and 13 were very similar. A furry plush toy bear on a table looked slightly cooler in the iPhone 14's picture than on the iPhone 13's, and its furry paws were slightly clearer on the new phone's shot. An unlit neon sign saying in a pitch black room also appeared cooler on the iPhone 14 than the iPhone 13, with both rendering the striped wallpaper in the background equally clearly. These results were the same when I used the ultrawide cameras to capture the scene too. In low light, the iPhone 14 was slightly better at showcasing details like my highlights and individual strands of my hair in photos shot with the rear camera, but otherwise things like brightness and color were about the same between the iPhone 14 and its predecessor. Even the portraits I shot of a glass of liquor in low light looked so similar they are impossible to identify without labels. Early though, the iPhone 14 sometimes took pictures that were less saturated. The iPhone 14 did produce mildly improved selfies in low light. While autofocus is a new feature this year, it didn't make my pictures dramatically better. Details like the scarring on my cheeks were clearer in low light selfies from the new phones, but the two devices were on par in daylight. The iPhone 14 also features the new action mode for improved stabilizations in videos, and like most of the other updates this year, this provides only a small enhancement. That's in part because Apple's video stabilization was already pretty effective, and the benefits brought by action mode aren't so obvious. But if you are into shooting extremely shaky footage with your iPhone 14, action mode should be handy. Thanks to a new high G accelerometer and high dynamic range gyroscope, Apple was able to add a crash detection feature to the iPhone 14 series. This isn't something I can safely test, unfortunately. All iPhones, Pro or not, will also be able to connect to satellite, so you can send emergency messages when cellular or Wi-Fi signals aren't available. This feature is rolling out in November in the US, and based on a private demo I saw following the Apple event, it appeared to work. First, when you are away from cellular and Wi-Fi networks, you will see an SOS graphic that lets you know you can still dial 911, and the iPhone will use any other available network or place to call. But when none of those are available, you want to use emergency SOS via satellite, you will first have to use the phone app to dial 911. When the device is unable to connect and you are in a situation with satellite accesses, Apple will prompt you to use satellite communications. Having to first dial 911 seems unintuitive if your focus is trying to send a text or connect to a satellite, but Apple wants you to think of this feature as more of a last resort when trying to contract emergency services fails. The company has relay centers set up too, with staff who are trained to help users get in touch with the closest emergency responders in case there aren't any nearby that accept text messages. Another change to the iPhone 14 line is the removal of the SIM card tray. I have long felt that a seamless world is a seamless world, and when carriers worldwide support it, will be able to more conveniently roam globally. The problem is, I'm not sure we have the infrastructure yet. Apple may have been premature in getting rid of the SIM card tray, but it could give US carriers the push they need to adopt the format. Apple has offered eSIM support since the iPhone XR in 2018, and the company states it's had a lot of adoption growth. With the iPhone 13 last year, Apple started using eSIM as the primary method of activation in all US retail stores too. In general, setting up my review unit service was painless. All I had to do was wait 2 minutes for Verizon to activate my line. Apple also offered the option of converting my existing physical card to digital one without having to leave my apartment. It's funny that Apple has thrown caution to the wind and fully embraced eSIM before it adopted USB-C, though the charging standard is more prevalent and would make many people's lives more convenient. This is one area where the iPhone 14 feels stuck in the past. The iPhone 14 may use last year's A15 Bionic processor, but it's still a capable phone that holds its own against this year's flagships. My favorite rounds of Royal Match while messaging follow reviewers. My thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro all happened smoothly, and in general the phone stayed cool to the touch. The iPhone 14 may use last year's A15 Bionic processor, but it's still a capable phone that holds its own against this year's flagship. It got warm when I repeatedly tested the selfie camera's autofocus in low light, but didn't get alarmingly hot. It also managed to last an entire day that started with an 8 a.m. workout class. At about 10 p.m., I was down to less than 15% and had to activate low power mode before I could get home and charge it. That got me to 12:30 p.m. with 6% left, and I was still able to snap some pictures during that time. The iPhone 14 is very similar to the iPhone 13, which itself was very similar to the iPhone 12. That doesn't mean it's a bad phone, it's just less of an upgrade for anyone using a phone that's only 2 years old. You will notice a bigger difference if you are going to the iPhone 14 from the 11 or older, since new features like emergency SOS via satellite and crash detections are hopefully things you won't need to use much. For those people, the iPhone 14 will be a satisfying daily driver.